The briefing room at Nelly's Air Force Base fell silent when Colonel Marcus Vance announced the red flag exercise parameters. 200 personnel sat in rigid attention as the overhead projector displayed the scenario: a simulated strike package against fortified enemy positions in contested airspace. What nobody knew yet was that, in 72 hours, this routine training evolution would become the most dissected mission in modern Air Force history. Not because of the strategic complexity or the technological demonstration, but because of who ended up in the cockpit of Raptor 01 when everything went catastrophically wrong. The mission brief continued with standard protocols, threat assessments, and rules of engagement. Senior officers nodded at familiar doctrine, while junior pilots scribbled notes about altitude restrictions and communication frequencies. In the back row, Captain Nadia Volkov sat motionless, her slate-gray eyes tracking the presentation with the kind of attention that suggested she was recording every detail in permanent memory. Nobody looked her way. Nobody ever did. She'd been stationed at Nelly's for 8 months as an administrative liaison, processing flight reports and coordinating logistics between squadrons. Her uniform was impeccable but unremarkable. Her demeanor was professional but forgettable. When she spoke during operational meetings, which was rarely, her voice carried a faint Eastern European accent that some officers found vaguely amusing. They knew she'd flown before her reassignment, some transport role probably, maybe cargo runs in the desert. The kind of background that didn't warrant questions. What they didn't know, what couldn't be found in any accessible personnel file, was that before her American citizenship and her bureaucratic posting, Nadia Volkov had been Najda Volkova, top graduate of the Krasnodar Higher Military Aviation School. They didn't know about the 28 sorties she'd flown over Syria and in Su-35, or the 11 confirmed kills that weren't listed in any official record, because those missions had never officially occurred. They didn't know that she'd defected not out of ideology but out of survival, after witnessing things that made continuing service impossible. They didn't know her call sign in that other life had been Ghost, because enemy pilots reported her attacks but never saw her coming. The Americans had buried all of it during her asylum processing, given her a new identity, a fresh start, a quiet desk job where her skills could atrophy in safety. She'd accepted this arrangement without complaint. Some cages are more comfortable than others, and at least this one didn't require her to compromise what remained of her conscience. But skills like hers don't atrophy. They hibernate. And when Colonel Vance dismissed the briefing and reminded everyone that Major Derek Halston would be leading the Raptor element, Nadia felt something stir in that cold place where she'd stored everything she used to be. Major Derek Halston was exactly the kind of pilot the Air Force put on recruiting posters. 6'2", strong jawline, confident stride, and a combat record impressive enough to warrant respect but not so extensive that it suggested he'd seen the kind of horror that leaves marks. He flew the F-22 Raptor like he'd been born to it, with the smooth precision of someone who'd never doubted his place in the sky. Other pilots called him Hammer because his approach to air combat was straightforward and devastating. He believed in overwhelming force applied with technical excellence. It was an approach that worked beautifully in scenarios where you had every advantage. He walked past Nadia's desk the next morning without acknowledgement, discussing flight parameters with his wingman, Captain Josh Rivera, call sign Razor. Their conversation was the easy banter of men who trusted each other completely, who trained together so long they could predict each other's moves in combat. Rivera was making jokes about the simulated enemy fighters they'd face, antiquated fourth-generation aircraft that wouldn't stand a chance against their Raptors. Halston laughed, confident and unbothered. From her desk, Nadia listened while processing maintenance reports. She knew that confidence. She'd seen it in Russian pilots too, young men who believed their superior aircraft made them invincible. Some of them had been right. Some of them had died surprised. She signed off on a fuel requisition and said nothing. Her role here wasn't to offer unwanted tactical observations. Her role was to be invisible, forgettable, safe. The morning proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Flight crews prepped their aircraft while ground personnel ran final checks on weapon systems and avionics. The F-22 Raptors sat in their hardened shelters like coiled predators, their angular stealth geometry designed to make them invisible to radar, nearly impossible to target. Each aircraft cost nearly $200 million and represented the absolute pinnacle of American air superiority technology. Only the most exceptional pilots earned the right to fly them. Nadia had never been in a Raptor's cockpit. Her clearance level didn't permit it, and nobody had ever suggested she needed access. When she walked past the flight line during her lunch break, she paused for just a moment to study the nearest aircraft. The crew chief, a staff sergeant named Williams, noticed her attention. He asked if she'd ever seen one up close before. She told him she hadn't, not like this. He offered a brief tour with obvious pride, explaining the thrust vectoring nozzles and the radar-absorbent coating. She listened politely, asked intelligent questions, and thanked him for his time. Williams would remember this conversation later, would tell investigators that she'd seemed interested but not unusually so, certainly not like someone who'd ever flown anything more complex than a simulator. That afternoon, Major Halston conducted his final mission brief with the strike package. 8 aircraft in total, 4 F-22s for air superiority, 2 F-15E Strike Eagles carrying precision munitions, and 2 F-16s in a suppression of enemy air defenses role. The simulated opposition force would be playing adversary tactics, trying to replicate how hostile nations might respond to an American strike. It was all carefully choreographed, all designed to test coordination and communication within acceptable risk parameters. Halston's briefing was textbook perfect, covering contingencies and abort criteria with the kind of thoroughness that demonstrated why he'd been selected for this leadership role. He designated ingress routes and target assignments, established communication protocols and emergency procedures. Every pilot in the room understood their responsibilities. It should have been a routine excellence demonstration, the kind of thing that happened dozens of times a year at Nellie's without incident. But routine evolutions only remain routine when every variable stays within expected parameters. And at 600 the next morning, while Halston was conducting his pre-flight inspection, he experienced the first symptoms of what would later be diagnosed as acute appendicitis. The pain started as a dull ache he tried to ignore, convinced it was just tension or bad food from the previous night's meal. By 6:30, when he was suiting up in his flight gear, the pain had intensified to the point where his hands were trembling slightly. By 700, when he was walking toward his aircraft, he was moving carefully, each step measured to minimize the stabbing sensation in his lower right abdomen. His wingman noticed something was off. Rivera asked if he was all right, and Halston gave the answer that every dedicated pilot gives when they don't want to be grounded. He was fine, just didn't sleep well, nothing that would affect his performance. Rivera accepted this because pilots learn not to question each other's readiness unless something is obviously wrong. What was obviously wrong didn't become apparent until Halston climbed into his cockpit and the physical strain of the confined space, the pressure of the harness, and the angle of the seat combined to create a level of pain that made continuing impossible. He tried. For 5 full minutes he tried to convince himself he could push through it, complete the mission, prove that he was tough enough to override his body's warnings. Then the flight surgeon arrived, summoned by a concerned crew chief who noticed Halston's gray complexion and labored breathing. The diagnosis was immediate and non-negotiable: grounded, emergency medical evaluation required, possible surgical intervention needed within hours. Halston argued briefly, insisting he could fly, but the surgeon had final authority on all medical fitness determinations. By 7:30, Major Derek Halston was being transported to the base hospital, and the entire red flag exercise was falling apart. Colonel Vance received the notification in his office and immediately began calculating options. The mission could be scrubbed entirely, disappointing the 200 personnel who'd prepared for weeks and wasting significant resources. It could be delayed, but the weather forecast showed a deteriorating pattern that would make rescheduling problematic. Or they could find a replacement pilot qualified to fly the F-22 and capable of leading the strike package on virtually zero notice. The problem with that third option was that F-22 pilots were rare, highly specialized, and carefully scheduled. The few qualified aviators on base were already assigned to other aircraft in the package or were unavailable for various administrative reasons. Vance scrolled through the personnel roster with increasing frustration, looking for anyone with Raptor certification who could step in. The list was discouragingly short. Then his deputy, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Reeves, made a suggestion that seemed to come from nowhere. She mentioned that Captain Volkov had flight experience, extensive hours actually, and while her current role was administrative, her personnel file indicated previous military aviation service. Vance looked up from his computer with skepticism clearly visible. The quiet woman who processed paperwork, the liaison officer who barely spoke during meetings. Reeves acknowledged it seemed unlikely, but pointed out they were running out of options fast. Vance pulled up Nadia's service record, found the sanitized version that confirmed she'd flown before her immigration, but details were classified above his clearance level. He saw only that she'd logged significant flight hours in high-performance aircraft and had received asylum under circumstances related to her military service. The specifics were redacted. He made the call that would change everything. He summoned Captain Volkov to his office immediately. Nadia walked into Colonel Vance's office at 7:45 with the calm demeanor of someone who'd been expecting this moment for years, even if she'd hoped it would never come. Vance didn't waste time on pleasantries. He explained the situation directly. Halston was down, the mission was scheduled, and he needed a pilot. He asked if she had F-22 experience. She told him the truth, that she'd never flown an F-22 specifically, but she'd flown similar high-performance fighters extensively. Vance's expression suggested he was already regretting this conversation, but desperation makes people consider options they'd normally dismiss immediately. He asked what aircraft she'd flown before. She paused, weighing how much truth to reveal, then told him she'd flown the Su-35 in combat operations, multiple sorties, advanced tactical scenarios. The office went very quiet. Vance studied her face, searching for any sign of exaggeration or delusion. He found neither. He asked how many combat hours she had in the Su-35. She told him 83 hours across 28 missions, all in contested airspace. He asked about her kill record. She met his eyes without flinching and said 11 confirmed, 3 probables. The silence extended. Vance was doing calculations in his head, assessing risk versus necessity. The Su-35 was a formidable aircraft, 4th generation plus with thrust vectoring and advanced avionics. Anyone who'd logged real combat hours in that platform would have skills that transferred. But going from a Russian fighter to an American stealth aircraft on zero notice was asking for disaster. He asked why she'd never mentioned this background before. She replied that she'd been instructed not to, that her asylum agreement included provisions about maintaining a low profile and not drawing attention to her previous service. Everything had been handled through channels he didn't have access to. She'd followed orders, accepted her administrative role, and tried to build a life that didn't involve combat. Vance appreciated the honesty but still faced an impossible choice. He could put an unknown quantity in his most advanced aircraft and hope her claimed skills were real, or he could scrub a major exercise and accept the professional consequences. Neither option was appealing. He asked the question that mattered most. Could she actually fly the mission successfully? Nadia considered this carefully before answering. She told him that the F-22's flight characteristics would be different from what she was accustomed to, but the fundamental principles of air combat remained constant regardless of the aircraft. She understood tactical geometry, energy management, situational awareness, and decision-making under pressure. She could read a threat picture and respond appropriately. What she couldn't guarantee was seamless integration with systems she'd never operated before, but she was a fast learner, and the basic stick and rudder skills would translate. Vance made his decision in the way commanders do when all options are bad. He chose the least bad one. He told her she had 30 minutes to get to the flight line, receive a crash briefing on the F-22 systems from the crew chief and the operations officer, and prove she could at minimum operate the aircraft safely. If she demonstrated basic competency, she'd fly the mission. If not, they'd scrub everything. Nadia stood, thanked him for the opportunity, and left without another word. By 8:20, she was standing next to Raptor 01 in her hastily fitted flight suit, listening to Staff Sergeant Williams explain the cockpit layout with barely concealed anxiety. Williams had given tour before, but never to someone who was about to actually fly the aircraft after a 30-minute familiarization. He went through the primary flight controls, the heads-up display, the multifunction displays that controlled everything from weapons to communications to threat detection. He showed her the throttle quadrant with its castle switch and speed brake controls, explained the stick's force feedback, and the side stick controller's sensitivity. Nadia absorbed it all with focused intensity, asking specific questions that surprised Williams with their technical sophistication. She wanted to know about the fly-by-wire system's response curves, the trust vectoring implementation, and the sensor fusion algorithms that process data from multiple sources. These weren't questions from someone learning to fly. These were questions from someone who already knew how to fly and just needed to understand this specific aircraft's interpretation of familiar concepts. Captain Rivera watched from a distance, increasingly uncertain about what he was witnessing. The operations officer, Major Christine Park, arrived to conduct the system's briefing with profound skepticism radiating from every gesture. Park had been flying F-22s for 6 years and didn't appreciate the implication that someone could just step into the cockpit after a brief tutorial and manage one of the world's most complex aircraft. She ran through the checklist procedures with deliberate speed, testing whether Nadia could keep up. Engine start sequence, avionics initialization, communications protocols, navigation system setup, weapons management protocols. Nadia followed along without visible strain, occasionally asking for clarification on interface details but demonstrating comprehension of the underlying systems. Park's skepticism began shifting toward confusion. This wasn't how someone unfamiliar with advanced fighters typically responded to information overload. After 20 minutes, Park stopped mid-explanation and asked directly, what exactly had Nadia flown before? Nadia repeated what she'd told Vance, adding that while the interfaces were different, the operational logic was similar to what she trained on. Park processed this, made a decision, and told Nadia she was going to run through several emergency procedures. If Nadia could talk through the appropriate responses, Park would sign off on the flight. The procedures Park chose weren't basic. She described an engine fire during takeoff, a hydraulic failure at altitude, and a flight control system malfunction during combat maneuvering. Nadia responded to each scenario with appropriate actions, explaining her reasoning in calm, methodical detail. Her answers weren't textbook perfect for the F-22 specifically, but they demonstrated sound aeronautical judgment and understanding of emergency priorities. Maintain aircraft control, analyze the situation, take appropriate action, and land as soon as conditions permit. Park concluded the evaluation with a single question. Was Nadia confident she could fly this aircraft safely? Nadia's response was measured and honest. She said she was confident in her flying skills, but acknowledged she was unfamiliar with this specific platform. She would fly conservatively, rely on the aircraft's advanced automation where appropriate, and focus on mission completion rather than demonstrating advanced techniques. Park respected the self-awareness. She signed the authorization form and told Nadia not to get killed. By 900, Nadia was strapped into Raptor 01's cockpit, running through pre-flight checks with Williams guiding her over the intercom. The seat fit reasonably well after adjustments, the harness was secure, and the helmet's display systems activated properly once she completed the initialization sequence. She could see the multifunction displays coming online, showing aircraft system status, navigation data, and tactical information. It was overwhelming in its complexity, but she'd been overwhelmed before. The key was to prioritize, focus on what mattered immediately, and trust her training to handle the rest. Williams asked if she was ready for engine start. She confirmed, received clearance from the tower, and began the sequence. The twin Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines spooled up with a rising whine that built into a barely contained roar. She could feel the power through the airframe, almost 35,000 pounds of thrust per engine, enough to push this aircraft to speeds exceeding Mach 2 and altitudes above 50,000 feet. The vibration settled into a steady rhythm as the engines reached idle power. All systems showed green. She was actually going to do this. The other pilots in the strike package were already airborne, circling in the holding pattern, waiting for their leader to join them. Captain Rivera had taken temporary command, but the mission plan called for Raptor 01 to lead. Protocol demanded it. Nadia received taxi clearance and advanced the throttles slightly, feeling the aircraft begin to move. The nose-wheel steering was responsive, maybe slightly more sensitive than she'd expected. She made minor corrections as she taxied toward the runway, trying to develop a feel for how the aircraft responded to inputs. Ground personnel watched her taxi past with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Word had spread fast that someone unfamiliar was flying Halston's aircraft. Some considered it inspiring that an administrative officer was stepping up. Others considered it potentially catastrophic. At the runway threshold, Nadia ran through the final checks, confirmed her flight control surfaces were responding correctly, and received takeoff clearance. She advanced the throttles to military power, feeling the acceleration press her back into the seat. The runway centerline tracked straight ahead. At rotation speed, she applied gentle back pressure on the stick, and the Raptor lifted smoothly into the morning sky. The initial climb was steady and controlled, exactly what it should be, but Nadia was processing a dozen new sensations simultaneously. The visibility from the canopy was exceptional, the aircraft's response to control inputs was precise, and the power available was extraordinary. She'd flown fast aircraft before, but the Raptor's thrust-to-weight ratio was in a different category entirely. She could feel it wanting to accelerate to climb, to demonstrate what it was capable of. She kept it restrained, focusing on basic aircraft control while she adjusted to the new environment. Tower directed her toward the holding pattern where the rest of the strike package waited. She acknowledged and began a climbing turn, checking her tactical display to locate the other aircraft. 8 contacts appeared on the screen, each tagged with identification data. Rivera's voice came over the radio, professional but with an edge of uncertainty, welcoming her to the formation and requesting confirmation that she had the tactical picture. She confirmed, her voice calm and accented, stating she was mission-capable and ready to proceed. There was a pause, then Rivera acknowledged and briefed the ingress route. They would proceed north toward the red flag range, maintain formation discipline, and execute the attack plan as briefed. Nadia rogered the transmission and maneuvered into position as Raptor 01, the mission lead. The other pilots watched her join the formation with varying degrees of confidence. Some had heard she'd flown before and were willing to give her the benefit of the doubt. Others were already calculating how quickly they could adapt if she made critical errors. The Strike Eagles and the F-16s maintained their positions, trusting that whoever was leading them knew what they were doing. The flight to the range took 18 minutes, enough time for Nadia to become more comfortable with the Raptor's handling characteristics and the tactical display's presentation of information. She monitored the formation spacing, made minor corrections to maintain proper geometry, and reviewed the mission parameters one final time. The objective was straightforward: suppress enemy air defenses, establish air superiority, and enable the Strike Eagles to deliver their precision weapons on simulated ground targets. The opposing force was operating out of a remote section of the range, using fourth-generation fighters to simulate hostile aircraft. They would attempt to intercept the strike package, disrupt the mission, and achieve simulated kills against the Americans. It was all carefully monitored and controlled, with safety officers tracking every aircraft and strict rules of engagement preventing actual danger. Or at least, that was the plan. At 9:35, as the strike package crossed into the exercise area, the tactical picture began to develop. The opposing force had deployed in a layered defense, with some aircraft at low altitude attempting to avoid detection and others at medium altitude ready to intercept. Nadia studied the threat display, identifying the pattern immediately. She'd seen this defensive setup before, in Syria, where Russian doctrine emphasized forcing attackers to commit before revealing the full defensive deployment. She keyed her radio and began issuing instructions to the package, directing the F-16s to engage the simulated surface-to-air missile sites while the other Raptors positioned for air-to-air combat. Her commands were clear and specific, demonstrating tactical understanding that surprised everyone listening. Rivera acknowledged her directions and moved into position, still uncertain but following the plan. Then everything changed. At 9:37, an actual emergency began developing that had nothing to do with the exercise. One of the opposing force aircraft, an F-16 playing the role of a hostile fighter, experienced a legitimate hydraulic failure. The pilot, a major named Stevens, immediately declared an emergency over the radio, stating he was losing flight control authority and needed to recover immediately. The safety officer monitoring the exercise began coordinating his emergency landing, directing all other aircraft to clear the airspace and provide support. Standard procedure demanded the exercise be suspended immediately, all aircraft return to base, and emergency services prepare for a potentially difficult landing. But Stevens' situation was deteriorating faster than anyone anticipated. His second hydraulic system failed 30 seconds after the first, leaving him with severely limited control authority. He was 20 miles from the nearest suitable runway, losing altitude and fighting to keep the aircraft stable enough to reach safety. Nadia heard the emergency calls and made a decision that revealed everything about who she actually was. Instead of following the recall order with everyone else, she broke formation and accelerated toward Stevens' position. Rivera called after her, confused and concerned, asking what she was doing. She responded that Stevens needed assistance immediately, that he might need to eject, and that someone should be there to coordinate rescue. It wasn't standard procedure. It wasn't her assigned role. But it was the right thing to do, and she'd spent too many years watching pilots die alone to let it happen when she could help. She covered the distance in 90 seconds, the Raptor's supercruise capability allowing her to accelerate to Mach 1.5 without using afterburners. She spotted Stevens' aircraft visually, a dark speck against the desert landscape, trailing a thin stream of hydraulic fluid that caught the sunlight. She maneuvered alongside him, close enough to assess the damage visually, and keyed her radio. She asked Stevens for his status in a voice that carried absolute calm despite the crisis. Stevens responded that he had maybe 20% control authority, his backup systems were failing, and he wasn't sure he could make it to the runway. Nadia asked about his altitude and airspeed. Stevens reported 6,000 feet and descending, 200 knots and struggling to maintain it. She did the calculations instantly and told him he wouldn't make the runway with his current energy state. She had a different plan. There was a dry lakebed 12 miles to the east, perfectly flat, hard-packed, long enough for an emergency landing if he could maintain control for the approach. Stevens knew the lakebed she meant but wasn't confident he could navigate there with his degraded controls. Nadia told him she'd guide him in, that she'd fly formation with him the entire way, that she'd talk him through every adjustment. The confidence in her voice, the certainty, cut through Stevens' rising panic. He agreed to try. For the next 8 minutes, Nadia flew the most precise formation of her life, positioning her Raptor exactly alongside Stevens' crippled F-16, close enough that he could use her aircraft as a visual reference for attitude and alignment. She called out instructions with measured precision, telling him when to apply slight back pressure, when to ease off, when to use rudder to correct his heading. Stevens followed her guidance, fighting his degraded controls, trusting this unknown pilot's judgment because the alternative was ejection over rough terrain. The lakebed appeared ahead, a vast expanse of white salt flats stretching for miles. Nadia directed him toward the smoothest section, adjusting her position to help him establish the proper descent profile. At 1,000 feet, Stevens' aircraft began rolling unexpectedly to the right, the result of asymmetric hydraulic pressure. He corrected instinctively, overcorrected, and the aircraft snapped into an incipient spin. For 3 seconds, everyone monitoring the situation thought they were watching a pilot die. Then Nadia's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. She told Stevens to neutralize his controls, let the aircraft stabilize, don't fight it. Stevens did exactly what she said, forcing himself to release pressure on the stick despite every instinct screaming to wrestle the aircraft back under control. The F-16 stopped spinning, transitioned into a nose-low attitude, and began accelerating in a dive. Nadia told him to pull gently back, very gently, just enough to arrest the descent. Stevens complied, and the aircraft's nose came up incrementally. At 400 feet, he had regained something resembling controlled flight. Nadia repositioned alongside him and resumed her guidance. They were 2 miles from the lakebed. She told him to maintain current attitude, don't change anything, just let the aircraft settle into a shallow descent. Stevens acknowledged with a voice that had moved beyond fear into a strange calm that comes when you've accepted that your life is in someone else's hands. At 200 feet, Nadia told him to prepare for landing, to keep his nose slightly high, to aim for the smoothest section of the lakebed ahead. She would stay with him until touchdown. Stevens followed every instruction precisely. At 50 feet, his aircraft was stable. At 20 feet, his landing gear touched the salt flat's surface. The touchdown was harder than ideal but controlled. The F-16 bounced once, settled, and rolled out across the lakebed in a cloud of white dust. Stevens brought his aircraft to a stop after a landing roll that covered half a mile. He sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands shaking, adrenaline flooding his system, trying to process what had just happened. Nadia circled overhead once, confirmed he was safely down, then called it in to the safety officer. She reported that Stevens had made a successful emergency landing on the lakebed, appeared to be uninjured, and rescue personnel should proceed to his location. The safety officer acknowledged with obvious relief and asked for her identification. She stated she was Raptor 01, Captain Volkov. There was a pause on the other end, as if the safety officer was trying to reconcile this voice, this competence, with the administrative liaison they'd all dismissed. He thanked her for the assistance and directed her to return to base. She acknowledged and turned her Raptor southward. The entire strike package had witnessed what happened, their tactical frequencies filled with her precise guidance and Stevens' survival. As Nadia flew back toward Nellie's, her radio came alive with transmissions. Rivera called first, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and confusion, asking if she was all right. She confirmed she was fine. Then the Strike Eagle pilots chimed in, acknowledging her handling of the emergency. Then the F-16 pilots. One by one, the aviators she'd been leading offered their respect for what they'd just witnessed. Nadia accepted their words with simple acknowledgments, uncomfortable with the attention. She'd just done what needed doing, nothing more. But she could feel something shifting in how they heard her voice now, how they responded to her transmissions. She wasn't the quiet administrative officer anymore. She was a pilot who just saved a life with skills that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Back at Nellie's, Colonel Vance had been monitoring the emergency from the operations center, listening to Nadia's calm instructions and Stevens' struggling responses. He'd watched the whole thing unfold on radar, seen her break formation without authorization, and witnessed her guide Stevens to safety through precise flying and tactical communication. When it was over, he'd sat back in his chair and allowed himself a moment of genuine amazement. The landing pattern at Nellie's was busy when Nadia returned, multiple aircraft recovering from the aborted exercise and emergency response aircraft returning to normal operations. She entered the pattern professionally, received clearance, and brought the Raptor down with a landing so smooth the tower controller commented on it. She taxied to the hardstand where Williams and his crew were waiting, shut down the engines according to the checklist procedure, and climbed out of the cockpit feeling the weight of what had just happened. Williams approached with an expression that suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he knew. He asked if she was really all right, if the flight had gone okay. She told him the aircraft performed perfectly, thanked him for the excellent maintenance, and walked toward the debriefing area. Stevens landed 30 minutes later, flown in by helicopter from the lakebed, looking pale but grateful. He sought out Nadia immediately, found her completing paperwork in the operations building, and tried to express his thanks. She told him he'd done the hard part, that his flying had kept them both alive. He disagreed strongly, saying her guidance had been the difference between a successful landing and ejecting over rough terrain. They talked for a few minutes, pilot to pilot, sharing the kind of conversation that happens between people who have been through something significant together. Then Colonel Vance arrived and requested Nadia's presence in his office. The debriefing took 2 hours and covered everything from her decision to break formation to her specific instructions to Stevens to her overall handling of the Raptor. Vance asked pointed questions about her training, her experience, and her decision-making process. Nadia answered honestly, explaining that she'd recognized Stevens wouldn't make the runway and that the lakebed was the best option. She'd drawn on her combat experience to stay calm under pressure and her training to maintain precise formation flying. Vance listened without interruption, taking notes, clearly compiling a report that would go much higher up the chain of command. When he finished his questions, he told her something she hadn't expected. The exercise was being rescheduled for the following week, and he wanted her to lead it, not as a replacement, but as the designated mission commander. Her performance today had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded what anyone had anticipated, and he believed she could execute the mission successfully. Nadia started to protest, to explain that she wasn't supposed to draw attention, that her agreement with the asylum process included maintaining a low profile. Vance cut her off gently and told her that agreement was made under different circumstances. She just saved a pilot's life in front of dozens of witnesses. There was no low profile anymore. She could either embrace the opportunity or spend the rest of her career wondering what might have happened if she'd had the courage to fly again. It was a choice, and he respected whichever way she decided, but he needed an answer soon. Nadia sat in silence for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision. She'd spent years trying to leave her past behind, to build a life that didn't involve combat or violence or the constant tension of tactical flying. But sitting in that Raptor's cockpit, guiding Stevens to safety, she'd felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Russia: purpose. Not the corrupted purpose of serving a regime she couldn't respect, but the pure purpose of using her skills to protect someone who needed help. She looked at Colonel Vance and gave him her answer. She would lead the mission. The next 6 days were a blur of intensive preparation. Nadia worked with the operations staff to refine the mission plan, incorporating lessons from the aborted exercise and adapting tactics to account for the opposing forces' likely responses. She studied the F-22's advanced systems in depth, spending hours in simulators and receiving additional instruction from Major Park, who transitioned from skeptical evaluator to genuinely impressed mentor. Park had seen a lot of pilots in her career, but Nadia's combination of natural talent and hard-won experience was unusual. During one late-night simulator session, Park asked about Nadia's background, specifically about her time in the Su-35. Nadia shared some of it, carefully edited but truthful. She described the training, the pressure, the constant awareness that mistakes would be fatal. She talked about the difference between Western and Russian tactical doctrine, how American pilots relied on superior technology and information superiority, while Russian pilots trained to compensate for technological disadvantages through aggressive maneuvering and creative tactics. Park listened with fascination, recognizing that she was hearing perspectives most American pilots never encountered. She asked if Nadia missed it, the combat flying. Nadia's answer was complicated. She missed the clarity of it, the absolute focus required when your life depends on making correct decisions in seconds. But she didn't miss the moral ambiguity, the knowledge that you were part of a system that valued power over people. Park understood, or tried to, and told Nadia that whatever else happened, she was glad Nadia was on their side now. The comment stayed with Nadia long after the simulator session ended. Was she on their side? She defected, accepted asylum, taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution. But did that make her American, or just someone who'd found a safer cage? The question had no easy answer, but flying the mission next week would be a statement regardless. The other pilots in the strike package received briefings about the change in mission commander. Most accepted it professionally, impressed by what they'd witnessed during Stephen's emergency. A few were skeptical, concerned about following someone with such an unconventional background. Rivera fell somewhere in the middle. He'd flown with Halston for years and trusted him completely. Trusting Nadia would require proof she could lead effectively under pressure. During the mission brief 4 days before the flight, Nadia addressed the concerns directly. She acknowledged she was unconventional, that her background was different from theirs, but emphasized that the mission's success depended on everyone executing their roles professionally. She wasn't asking them to trust her personality or her history. She was asking them to trust her tactical judgment and her commitment to bringing everyone home safely. It was a short speech, delivered without drama, but it resonated. The night before the rescheduled mission, Nadia sat alone in her quarters reviewing the plan one final time. She'd memorized every detail, every contingency, every communication protocol. The mission itself wasn't extraordinarily complex, but leading it successfully required coordinating 8 aircraft, managing multiple threat streams, and adapting to whatever surprises the opposing force created. She'd done similar missions before, but never in this aircraft, never with these people, and never with so much attention focused on her performance. Sleep came eventually, restless but sufficient. She woke at 500, went through her pre-flight routine with methodical precision, and arrived at the briefing room 30 minutes early. The other pilots filtered in gradually, exchanging quiet greetings and last-minute checks of their mission materials. At 600, Nadia began the brief exactly as Major Halston would have, covering every aspect of the mission with clarity and confidence. She addressed questions professionally, incorporated suggestions when they improved the plan, and established herself as someone who valued input but would make final decisions decisively. By 700, everyone was moving toward their aircraft. The morning was clear and calm, perfect flying weather. Nadia walked to Raptor 01 feeling the familiar pre-mission tension, the heightened awareness that comes before combat. This wasn't actual combat, but her body didn't distinguish between training and the real thing. Adrenaline sharpened her senses, slowed time slightly, prepared her for what was coming. Williams met her at the aircraft with a thumbs up and a grin. He'd become something of a believer after her emergency response, and he'd made sure her Raptor was in absolutely perfect condition. She thanked him, conducted her walk-around inspection, and climbed into the cockpit. The pre-flight checks went smoothly, each system responding exactly as it should. At 7:45, she received engine start clearance and brought the twin F-119s to life. The familiar roar settled into a steady rhythm. She was ready. The taxi and takeoff proceeded without incident. 8 aircraft lifted off in sequence, formed up over the desert, and began their ingress toward the exercise area. Nadia flew lead with confidence born from preparation and experience. She monitored the tactical display, communicated with her wingmen, and maintained awareness of the overall battlespace picture. The opposing force would be waiting somewhere ahead, and the first challenge would be detecting them before they detected the strike package. The F-22's stealth capabilities provided a significant advantage, but stealth wasn't invisibility. Skilled adversaries with proper tactics could still detect and engage stealth aircraft if they knew what to look for. At 8:15, the first contacts appeared on Nadia's threat display. Two aircraft at medium altitude, maneuvering in a pattern consistent with a defensive counter-air patrol. She identified them to the package and directed the other Raptors to position for engagement. The rules of engagement for the exercise required simulated weapons employment, with kills determined by sophisticated computer systems that tracked aircraft positions, weapons parameters, and threat geometry. It was as close to real combat as training could get without actual missiles. Nadia analyzed the tactical geometry and recognized the pattern immediately. The two visible aircraft were bait, positioned to draw the strike package into a predetermined engagement area where additional opposing aircraft were likely waiting. She'd used this tactic herself in Syria, sacrificing one element to achieve a favorable multi-aircraft engagement. She keyed her radio and told the package to ignore the bait, maintain course, and prepare for additional contacts. Rivera acknowledged with a voice that carried new respect. 30 seconds later, 4 more aircraft appeared on the threat display, exactly where Nadia had predicted they'd be, positioned to catch the Americans in a crossfire if they'd taken the bait. The tactical situation became complex quickly. 6 opposing aircraft versus the strike package's 4 Raptors, with the Strike Eagles and F-16s vulnerable if they couldn't establish air superiority. Nadia began issuing rapid commands, directing her wingmen to engage specific threats while maintaining formation integrity. The ensuing simulated combat lasted 7 minutes and demonstrated tactical flying of the highest caliber. Nadia maneuvered her Raptor with precision that suggested intimate familiarity with air combat geometry, positioning for simulated missile shots that the computer system evaluated as high-probability kills. She achieved 2 simulated kills in the first 3 minutes while avoiding simulated threats through aggressive defensive maneuvering. Her wingmen followed her instructions and engaged their targets successfully, establishing air superiority through coordinated tactics and superior situational awareness. The opposing force pilots fought well, but they were facing someone whose experience level exceeded anything they'd anticipated. When the simulation ended, the computer scoring showed the strike package had achieved complete air superiority with 0 friendly losses and 6 confirmed enemy kills. The Strike Eagles proceeded to their targets unmolested and delivered their simulated weapons with textbook precision. Mission success, flawless execution, exactly the outcome Colonel Vance had hoped for but hadn't quite dared to expect. The flight back to Nellie's was quieter, each pilot processing what had just happened. They'd participated in a training evolution that felt more like operational combat than any exercise they'd experienced before. The debriefing lasted 3 hours and covered every aspect of the mission in exhaustive detail. Nadia explained her tactical decisions, her threat assessments, and her reasoning for each command she'd issued. The other pilots contributed their perspectives, and a picture emerged of someone who thought several moves ahead, anticipated enemy actions, and positioned friendly forces to exploit advantages while minimizing vulnerabilities. Major Park, who'd observed the entire evolution from the operations center, summed it up concisely. They just witnessed tactical flying from someone who'd learned her skills in an environment where mistakes meant death rather than simulator resets. Colonel Vance's report to higher headquarters was unambiguous. Captain Nadia Volkov possessed exceptional tactical aviation skills, demonstrated sound judgment under pressure, and had successfully led a complex strike mission against competent opposition. He recommended she be considered for advanced responsibilities and possibly formal recognition of her capabilities. The report triggered a chain of events that neither Nadia nor Vance had anticipated. Within a week, officers from Air Combat Command arrived at Nellie's requesting detailed briefings about Nadia's background and performance. She spent hours answering questions about her training, her combat experience, and her defection. The interrogation was professional but thorough, designed to assess whether she represented a security risk or a valuable asset. The conclusion was the latter. Within 2 weeks, Nadia received orders assigning her to the F-22 training pipeline with a pathway toward becoming a formal instructor. Her administrative role was over. Her flying career had been resurrected. She accepted the assignment with mixed emotions: relief that she could fly again, anxiety about whether she could truly belong in this new world, gratitude for a second chance. And underneath it all, a lingering question about whether she deserved redemption for the things she'd done in her previous life. Captain Rivera sought her out the day before she transferred to her new assignment. He told her that flying with her had changed his understanding of what was possible in air combat, that her tactical awareness had been like watching someone play chess while everyone else played checkers. He asked if she'd ever consider sharing some of her knowledge, maybe conducting informal sessions about Russian tactics and how American pilots might counter them. Nadia considered the request and agreed. If she was going to be part of this community, she might as well contribute everything she could. The informal sessions became legendary. Nadia described tactical scenarios she'd flown or faced, explaining the decision trees and situational assessments that drove engagement outcomes. She talked about how Russian pilots were trained to exploit American reliance on technology, how to fight effectively when you couldn't count on superior sensors or weapons. The pilots who attended these sessions came away with expanded tactical vocabularies and deeper understanding of how their adversaries thought. Major Park attended several sessions and came to a realization: Nadia wasn't just a skilled pilot. She was a tactical artist who understood air combat at a level that couldn't be taught through normal training pipelines. Park wondered aloud how many other skills were being wasted in administrative positions because people didn't fit conventional categories. 6 months after the emergency that had revealed her capabilities, Nadia was a fully qualified F-22 instructor with a reputation that had spread throughout the fighter community. Pilots requested her sessions specifically, wanting to learn from someone who'd bridged two worlds and survived both. She remained quiet and professional, uncomfortable with attention, but committed to excellence. The call sign her new squadron gave her was inevitable once someone learned her Russian background: Ghost. When she protested that she'd had that call sign before, they told her it fit perfectly. She appeared out of nowhere, demonstrated skills nobody expected, and flew with a precision that made her opponents disappear. She accepted it with reluctant grace. Stevens, whose life she'd saved, became something of an advocate for her approach to tactical flying. He told anyone who'd listened that Nadia's calm guidance had been the difference between life and death, that her situational awareness and communication had been flawless under maximum pressure. He attended her sessions whenever possible and considered her a friend. One afternoon, during a debrief after a particularly challenging training mission, one of the younger pilots asked Nadia what she thought made someone a truly exceptional pilot. She considered the question carefully before answering. She told him it wasn't about natural talent or quick reflexes, though those helped. It was about the willingness to learn from every flight, to acknowledge mistakes honestly, to study failures more carefully than successes. Exceptional pilots understood that combat was ultimately about decision-making under pressure, and good decisions came from pattern recognition built through experience and study. The young pilot asked if she considered herself exceptional. Nadia's answer was characteristically modest. She considered herself experienced and still learning. Exceptional was a judgment others could make. But privately, alone in her quarters late at night, she sometimes allowed herself to acknowledge that yes, she was good at this. Very good. And for the first time in years, she was using those skills for something she could respect. The transformation from administrative officer to respected instructor took less than a year, but the impact would last much longer. Nadia's story spread through the fighter community, becoming a reminder that talent exists in unexpected places, and that assumptions about people based on their current roles can be dangerously wrong. She never sought recognition, never promoted herself, but her reputation grew anyway. Colonel Vance was promoted to brigadier general, and in his change of command speech, he mentioned the importance of recognizing potential in unconventional packages. Everyone in the audience knew he was talking about Nadia, even though he never said her name. Major Park was selected for squadron command and immediately requested Nadia as one of her instructor pilots. The request was approved. They would work together for 3 years, developing training programs that incorporated Nadia's tactical insights and Park's institutional knowledge. The programs produced pilots who thought differently, who questioned assumptions, and who approached combat with a deeper understanding of their adversary's capabilities and intentions. Rivera eventually became a squadron commander himself and made it a point to attend one of Nadia's tactical sessions annually. As a reminder of the day he'd watched an unknown pilot save a life and demonstrate skills he'd never imagined. He told new pilots the story regularly, emphasizing that competence can hide in administrative offices, that credentials don't tell the whole story, and that the quiet professional in the corner might be the most capable person in the room. Stevens never forgot what Nadia had done, and years later, when he was evaluating pilots for a special operations aviation unit, he specifically sought out aviators who combined technical skill with the kind of calm judgment Nadia had demonstrated. He wanted people who could think clearly when everything was going wrong, who could guide others through chaos. He found several, and each time he did, he thought of that morning over the desert when a voice with an accent had talked him safely to the ground. Nadia's legacy extended beyond her immediate circle. As more people learned her story, it prompted conversations about how military organizations identify and utilize talent. How many other skilled people were trapped in inappropriate roles because their backgrounds didn't fit standard categories? How many potential contributions were being lost because someone had checked the wrong boxes on an assessment form? The conversations led to policy reviews and eventually to changes in how foreign military experience was evaluated and incorporated. It was a small bureaucratic evolution, but it mattered. For Nadia herself, the years that followed her revelation brought something she'd almost forgotten: contentment. Not happiness exactly, not the uncomplicated joy of someone without a complicated past, but the quieter satisfaction of knowing she was contributing positively, using her skills to make others better and safer. She continued to fly, continued to teach, and slowly built a life that felt genuinely hers rather than something imposed by circumstances. She made friends, not many but genuine ones. She found a community that valued her for what she could do rather than dismissing her for who she'd been. She learned to separate her identity from her past actions, to accept that people could change, and that redemption was possible for those willing to do the work. 10 years after the emergency that had changed everything, Captain Nadia Volkov, now Major Volkov, stood in the same briefing room where Colonel Vance had once announced the red flag exercise that started it all. She was preparing to brief a new class of F-22 pilots, young officers eager to prove themselves and learn from one of the most respected instructors in the Air Force. She looked out at the faces, saw the mixture of curiosity and determination, and felt a connection that transcended her personal history. These pilots represented the future, and she had knowledge that could help them survive and succeed. It was a responsibility she took seriously. Her briefing covered tactical geometry and decision-making, using examples from her own experience without dwelling on the specific contexts. The pilots listened with rapt attention, taking notes, asking intelligent questions. One of them, a young lieutenant named Martinez, asked about handling situations where you're outnumbered and technologically disadvantaged. Nadia smiled slightly and told him that was her specialty. She explained how understanding your opponent's decision tree could create opportunities even when you were outmatched on paper. She described scenarios where inferior aircraft had defeated superior ones through tactical creativity and exploitation of enemy assumptions. Martinez listened carefully and asked a follow-up question. "How did you learn to think that way?" Nadia paused, weighing how much truth to share. Then she told him that she'd learned it flying in an environment where assumptions could get you killed, where technological superiority wasn't guaranteed, and where survival required thinking several moves ahead constantly. She'd learned it because the alternative was dying, and she'd been very interested in not dying. The honest answer resonated. These young pilots understood that combat wasn't theoretical for her, that the lessons she taught came from genuine experience in environments where mistakes had permanent consequences. After the briefing, several pilots approached with additional questions. Nadia spent an hour discussing specific scenarios and tactical options, enjoying the intellectual exchange. This was what teaching should be: experienced professionals sharing knowledge with eager learners who would take those lessons and build on them. As the last pilot left, Major Park entered the briefing room. She told Nadia that the Air Force was establishing a new advanced tactics training program and wanted Nadia to help design the curriculum. It would mean more responsibility, more visibility, and potentially a promotion to lieutenant colonel. Park asked if Nadia was interested. Nadia considered the offer seriously. More responsibility meant less flying time, but it also meant broader impact. She told Park she was interested, but wanted to ensure the program focused on substance rather than politics, on producing better pilots rather than generating impressive briefing slides. Park laughed and said that's exactly why they wanted Nadia involved, because she didn't care about politics or appearances, only about results. The program launched 6 months later with Nadia as one of 3 lead instructors. It focused on complex tactical scenarios, decision-making under uncertainty, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses. The first class of graduates were noticeably more tactically sophisticated than previous generations, and feedback from operational squadrons was universally positive. The program expanded, incorporating more instructors and broader scenarios. Nadia's role evolved from instructor to curriculum designer to tactical advisor. She briefed senior officers on adversary capabilities and recommended training evolutions to address identified gaps. Her advice was valued because it came from genuine understanding rather than theoretical study. She'd flown against American tactics, knew their strengths and vulnerabilities, and could articulate them clearly. During one high-level briefing to 3-star generals about evolving Russian aviation capabilities, Nadia was asked directly, if you were still flying for Russia, how would you engage American fighters? She answered honestly. She would exploit American reliance on superior sensors by operating in environments where those sensors were degraded. She would use terrain masking and aggressive maneuvers to close range quickly, negating standoff weapons' advantages. She would force Americans into close-quarters combat where pilot skill mattered more than technology. The generals listened intently, recognized the value of the perspective, and asked for a written assessment. Nadia provided it, detailed and comprehensive, outlining tactical approaches and recommending specific training evolutions to counter them. The assessment was classified and distributed to operational squadrons. Months later, she received feedback that her recommendations had been incorporated into training programs throughout the combat air forces. It was gratifying in a way she hadn't expected. Her past, once something to hide, had become a source of value. The skills learned in a different context were now protecting pilots she'd never met, contributing to a mission she believed in. It felt like a form of redemption, incomplete but genuine. Lieutenant Colonel Volkov's promotion came through 3 years after the Advanced Tactics program launched. The ceremony was small and professional, attended by colleagues who'd become friends and mentored pilots who'd become instructors themselves. Park gave a short speech about exceptional service and unconventional excellence. Rivera attended and congratulated her afterward, joking that he'd known she was special from the moment she'd ignored procedure to help Stevens. Stevens himself sent a message from his current assignment, thanking her again and nodding that every day since that emergency had been borrowed time made possible by her skills. Nadia accepted the congratulations with characteristic modesty, uncomfortable being the center of attention, but appreciating the genuine respect. That evening, Alone in her quarters, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about the young woman who'd graduated from Russian flight school full of idealism and confidence, who'd learned tactical flying in unforgiving circumstances, who'd made compromises to survive in a corrupt system. She thought about the defector who'd arrived in America with nothing but skills and desperate hope, who'd accepted an administrative exile because it was better than the alternative. And she thought about the instructor and advisor she'd become, someone who contributed positively and made a genuine difference. The journey between those three versions of herself had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led somewhere meaningful. The question that had haunted her for years, whether she deserved redemption, had gradually transformed into a different question. What would she do with the redemption she'd been given? The answer, she realized, was to keep teaching, keep flying, keep contributing until she couldn't anymore. To honor the second chance by helping others succeed and survive. To transform her complicated past into useful future. Years continued passing, each one adding new pilots trained, new programs developed, new contributions made. Nadia's reputation became institutional knowledge, the kind of thing senior officers reference when discussing tactical excellence. Young pilots learned her story in abbreviated form, the administrative officer who'd saved a life and revealed herself as a tactical genius. The details of her Russian background faded in importance compared to her American contributions. She became simply Ghost, the instructor who made everyone better. She mentored dozens of pilots who went on to their own successful careers. Some became squadron commanders, others became test pilots, a few became general officers. Many maintained contact with her, seeking advice during critical career decisions or tactical challenges. She provided counsel when asked, but never pushed herself forward. During a reunion of her first advanced tactics class, now senior officers themselves, one of them proposed a toast to the instructor who taught us to think like our enemies so we could defeat them. Nadia accepted the toast graciously, but amended the sentiment slightly. She told them she'd taught them to think like professional aviators who respected their opponent's capabilities while remaining confident in their own skills. Understanding your enemy wasn't about adopting their values, but about recognizing their competence and preparing accordingly. The distinction mattered to her. As she approached 20 years of American military service, Lieutenant Colonel Volkov received an unexpected invitation to speak at the Air Force Academy about tactical aviation and professional development. She accepted reluctantly, uncomfortable with public speaking, but recognizing the opportunity to influence future officers. Her speech focused not on her personal story, but on the importance of continuous learning, intellectual humility, and the recognition that excellence comes from diverse backgrounds and unconventional paths. She talked about seeing potential in unexpected places and the organizational responsibility to utilize talent effectively regardless of where it's found. The cadets listened respectfully, asked thoughtful questions, and several approached afterward to express appreciation for her candor. One cadet, a young woman who identified herself as a first-generation immigrant, thanked Nadia specifically for demonstrating that unconventional backgrounds could lead to meaningful service. Nadia told her that background mattered less than what you did with your opportunities, that talent and determination could overcome most obstacles if you were willing to work hard and accept help when offered. The conversation stayed with her during the flight back to Nellie's. That cadet represented something important, the continuing evolution of who could serve and excel, the slow expansion of what the military considered valuable. Nadia had benefited from that evolution, and she hoped her service had contributed to it continuing. The final years of her military career were marked by steady contributions rather than dramatic moments. She continued teaching, continued advising, continued flying when opportunities arose. She transitioned from active tactical instruction to curriculum development and strategic planning, helping design training programs for aircraft and scenarios that hadn't existed when she'd started. Her insights about adversary tactics remained valuable even as technology evolved, because underlying principles of air combat remained constant regardless of specific platforms. She retired as a colonel after 28 years of combined service, the last 20 in the United States Air Force. Her retirement ceremony was attended by hundreds of people whose careers she'd influenced directly or indirectly. Major General Park, now a two-star and responsible for all fighter training across the Air Force, gave the retirement speech. She talked about the day a quiet administrative officer had climbed into a Raptor and demonstrated skills nobody knew existed. She talked about the thousands of pilots who'd benefited from Nadia's teaching and the countless lives potentially saved by better tactical training. She talked about the importance of recognizing that talent doesn't always announce itself loudly, that competence can hide in unexpected places, and that organizational success requires looking beyond conventional categories. Nadia listened to the speech with characteristic discomfort, still not entirely comfortable being celebrated but appreciating the genuine sentiment. When it was her turn to speak, she kept it brief. She thanked the people who'd given her opportunities when she didn't fit standard categories. She thanked the pilots who'd trusted her guidance even when they had reason to be skeptical. She thanked the Air Force for allowing her to serve in a capacity that aligned with her skills and values. And she encouraged everyone present to look for talent in unexpected places, to question assumptions about who could contribute, and to remember that the quiet professional in the administrative office might be exactly who you need when crisis strikes. The speech ended to sustained applause. Afterward, during the reception, dozens of people approached to share personal stories about how her teaching had influenced their careers or their thinking. Stevens, now a colonel himself, gave her a photograph from the day she'd guided him to the lakebed landing, signed by everyone who'd witnessed the emergency. Rivera presented her with a custom flight suit patch depicting a ghost flying an F-22, created by the Advanced Tactics Program graduates. Park gave her a handwritten note that Nadia would read later, in private, expressing gratitude for a friendship that had changed her understanding of leadership and excellence. In retirement, Nadia remained connected to the fighter community through consulting work and occasional lectures. She wrote a tactical manual that became required reading at the Air Force Weapons School. She mentored young pilots informally, answering questions and providing perspective. She attended reunions and maintained friendships with people who'd become family. She'd built a life that felt genuinely hers, earned through competence and contributions rather than granted by circumstances. The young woman who defected from Russia with nothing but skills and hope had become an American success story, but not the simplified kind told in propaganda. Her story was complicated, marked by difficult choices and moral ambiguities that never fully resolved. She'd served a regime she came to oppose, made compromises that still troubled her conscience, and carried memories of combat that didn't fade with time. But she'd also used her second chance to contribute positively, to protect and teach people who deserved her best efforts, and to build something meaningful from the wreckage of her first career. Was it redemption? She still wasn't entirely sure, but it was service with dignity, and that felt sufficient. The legacy she left wasn't monuments or dramatic rescues, though those moments were remembered. Her real legacy was the thousands of pilots who flew better because she'd taught them, the tactical programs that incorporated her insights, and the organizational evolution toward recognizing talent in diverse forms. It was the quiet accumulation of competence shared and knowledge transferred, the fundamental work of making others better through patient instruction and honest assessment. 20 years after the emergency that had revealed her capabilities, a new generation of F-22 pilots attended a tactical briefing at Nellis. The instructor referenced a technique called the ghost maneuver, an approach to energy management in close combat that exploited opponent assumptions about American tactical preferences. The instructor explained that it had been developed by Colonel Volkov, one of the legendary instructors who'd shaped modern tactical training. A few of the pilots asked about Volkov, having heard the name but not knowing the full story. The instructor provided the abbreviated version, Administrative officer turned ace instructor, Russian defector who'd become American tactical genius, the quiet professional who'd saved a pilot's life and revolutionized how the Air Force thought about talent. The pilots listened with interest, made notes about the technique, and continued their training. For them, Nadia Volkov was history, a name attached to proven tactics and institutional knowledge. They'd benefit from her contributions without knowing the full complexity of her journey, which was exactly how she would have wanted it. Excellence speaks for itself. Character reveals itself through action. Competence matters more than credentials. These were the principles Nadia had demonstrated throughout her American service, and they remained her legacy long after her retirement. In a small house near Nellie's, Colonel Nadia Volkov, retired, occasionally looked up at the desert sky and watched contrails from aircraft executing training missions. She could identify most of them by their flight profiles, the aggressive angles of fighter training, the steady patterns of bombers, the precise formations of demonstration teams. Sometimes she imagined herself back in a cockpit, felt the phantom pressure of G-forces and the satisfaction of perfect tactical geometry. But those moments were nostalgia rather than regret. She'd flown her missions, taught her students, and contributed what she could. The young pilots creating those contrails were flying better because she'd been there, and that was enough. On clear evenings when the light hit the sky in particular ways, she sometimes thought about the other ghost, the young Russian pilot who believed she was serving honor and defending her homeland. That woman had been both right and wrong, competent and complicit, brave and blind. Nadia didn't judge her harshly anymore. Everyone's understanding evolves through experience, and wisdom often comes through the painful recognition of previous mistakes. The American ghost, the instructor and advisor, had been possible only because the Russian ghost had existed first. The skills were the same, the context had changed. And perhaps that was the real lesson. Talent is neutral, competence is morally agnostic, and what matters is the purpose toward which skills are directed. She'd used hers to survive, then to escape, then to serve something better. The arc wasn't simple redemption but something more complex, transformation through choice, evolution through opportunity, contribution through dedication. The sky darkened gradually, stars emerging in familiar patterns. Nadia watched until full night arrived, then turned away from the window and returned to her comfortable life, built carefully over years of patient work. The ghosts of her past were there, would always be there, but they'd become companions rather than tormentors. She'd made peace with complexity, accepted imperfect resolution, and found meaning in contribution. It was enough. It had to be.